one of the parts of the process that was interesting, and gets back to Edwin's point about our being listeners. At the Tribeca Center for the Arts, we had 3 meetings with families of victims, where there'd be 400 of them in the audience, and we'd be sitting on the stage. So it looks like it's supposed to be about us. But we introduced ourselves, and then were silent for 3 hours as we heard all the stories of families. And the family members would say what they wanted, how they wanted their loved ones to be remembered, what was lost to them. And our job was only to be informed by their stories. And I literally had to explain this to the other jury members. So what are we doing? They're going to be lobbying us. They were uncomfortable that they're going to be telling us what to do. And I said, no, you're not being told what to do. Your only job is to listen.
Listen and translate what they
Exactly
into
just
your
listen.
selection and into
Just
that.
listen. Just be informed by their stories of loss and their needs and what they would even like. Be informed by it. And the difference is, there's a big difference between being informed and being pressured. And you have to leave a space open in yourself to be informed, right?
It's a memorial for the whole nation, for the whole world, actually. So.
Yeah.
And now it's not finished yet, but we know how it will be.
Oh, the memorial
and
is finished, at least.
Yes, but
yeah.
not the museum.
And the museum's almost done. It'll be open. They're opening in May, they hope. So it's almost.
So
done.
we know how it is. Could you that you have gone through the whole process? Could you explain what it is? Describe
Sure.
it. What is
Well,
it? What kind of memorial is it?
Michael Arad, in the beginning, was a young architect who went to Dartmouth and then went to University of Georgia Tech University School of Architecture for his master's degree. Came back to New York and was trained. He's actually Israeli born and was the son of the Israeli ambassador to the United States at one point, and the son of the Israeli ambassador to Mexico before he was an Israeli ambassador to the United States. He loves America. He stayed in America. He married an Irish American from New York, and they live on kind of Tribeca, little walk-up flat. And the day the towers went down, he was on his roof and he watched the whole thing, just heartbroken, just distraught, as everybody, New York, but he felt it as personally as anybody. And he had a vision, as the way some artists will. He said, if there's ever going to be a memorial, it needs to be made of water, that is something living and ephemeral and moving and animate, and it must be the voids that are remembered, the loss that is remembered somehow, surrounded by water. So he envisioned taking the 1-acre footprints of the World Trade Center towers, moving them out to the harbor. And so that in the harbor, in the Hudson River, there would be 2 1-acre voids, water pouring down into these voids. So he could see the Hudson from his rooftop. And so in his mind's eye, he saw this. So he went up to the top of his roof and he made a water table with 2 voids, squares like that, to see what it would look like. And he took pictures of it. This was 2 months after the attacks. So it's in his brain. The memorial process is announced a year and a half later. And so he proposes what he called reflecting absence, 2 voids in the voids of the footprints. So the footprints would be articulated, they'd be 30 feet deep, and in the center of those big pools would be a further void going all the way down to bedrock. And that was it. So that was his board. And it was interesting. Well, we didn't look at it and say, oh, that's it. We looked at it and said, well, there's a concept. It's interesting, but we felt it was unfinished. It needed refinement. And remember, this, this jury, Maya Lin and Michael Van Valkenburg, and I mean, kind of, pretty smart architects, high-powered people.
Violet had gone through it herself.
Yeah, she'd gone through this herself. And it turns out that it's true that Michael Abrad had read everything Maya Lin had ever written. He'd read everything I'd ever written, and he was fascinated by Holocaust memorials. And so he came back. We met him for the first time. We only met the 8 finalists once we had named the designs, and then the identities were revealed to us. It was completely anonymous until we named 8 finalist designs, and we didn't know who the designers were when we named them. And so we met him, and we talked about what we liked and what we didn't like about it, and we thought that the plaza was way too barren, that there was no life, no trees, and that he had replicated the terrible super blocks. And so what we want to do is restore this to downtown and stitch it back in. And so we do have a bit of an agenda here. We want to bring this thing to grade. We don't want people to happen upon a big pit of destruction. We want to bring this back into the city and stitch it back in. And you've done that, but you've got these huge empty plazas, which will just be so inhospitable, the way that the big plazas were around the World Trade Center towers. Can you give us some life? You've got the water, that's good, and we like falling water. The galleries he had designed underneath so that you could actually go underneath and see the water coming down like these ribbons, a veil that you could see the sky through, which we liked very much, which ended up not being built because it was too expensive. So he came back with a few little trees. Not enough, not enough. Or can you go find a landscape architect? Go find the best landscape architect you know. And he went and found not just the best one he knew, but the best in the world, Peter Walker, who was then chairing Berkeley's School of Architecture. And he had done beautiful gardens in Japan, so he was very much a minimalist, but very much in tune with Japanese gardens and kind of horizontality, not verticality.
It's beautiful.
And so he came back and designed the groves of trees in what he called an abacus grid, so that the trees would be arranged the way the beads of an abacus can be arranged, so that from east-west they're going to be on neat rows. So if you're looking from east-west, you're seeing perfect rows of trees. But when you look from north-south, they're arranged randomly like a forest. So thereby combining the city grid with the random arrangements of nature at the same time.
Beautiful.
It's brilliant and gorgeous. And so the taller they grow, the deeper the volumes of the voids become. I mean, it's just so smart. And so we were won over and became huge advocates of this design. And then it was one of 3 finalists. And Maya Lin and I and Michael Van Valkenburg in particular wanted this design. And then in the end we convinced 10 out of the 12 jurors that this would be the design. So we voted it in. So we presented it and we wrote a rationale for it, explaining that it combines loss and regeneration. The trees will lose their leaves, and they will change color, and then they will come back every year. The cycle of life will be repeated, and that this is a place to find consolation as well as irredeemable loss. The voids can never be filled in. The loss is permanent. They will always be there. The falling water does remind you of falling nests, maybe a visual reference to the falling towers, And so loss and regeneration was the theme. And so we presented that down at Federal Hall, and it was a huge deal, and it was unveiled, and it got a pretty good reception. Everybody, obviously was waiting just to pounce on the decision.
Sure.
And we knew that, but we never would have brought something out without a rationale, without being able to support it. And we wouldn't let it hang out there to dry. So the very first question I got was, of course, now we could talk to the press. So somebody said, so James, let's see, you're on the jury for the Denkmal in Berlin. You chose Peter Eisenman. Peter Eisenman was Daniel Liebeskind's teacher at Cooper Union, and of course Daniel Liebeskind builds the Jewish Museum in Berlin with voids, 6 voids built into it. Liebeskind is now the master site planner for the World Trade Center tower. Haven't you guys basically just chosen another Holocaust memorial for downtown?
I'm sorry, what an unfair question.
And so I felt, a little offended, but I had to begin thinking about it. And then I realized that it's not completely unfair, that there is a preoccupation in Holocaust memorials with voids and absences, but it's in all of architecture. And so my answer was that it's not another Holocaust memorial, but architecture itself is now inflected by the Holocaust. The Holocaust did puncture in many contemporary architects' minds the rationality of culture and architecture. Never again would they build buildings that would kind of reassure us that all is on kind of this path toward enlightened, rationale.
And that's also a question of the language.
Deconstructivist architecture
you have
has
memorials
that.
that have a kind of tradition, and they are constructing a language. You can't invent maybe a completely another language
Exactly.
For a memorial.
This is
If
what's
you
already
have-
in their mind.
Yes, so it would be a rupture. It would be something.
Yeah.
It's not the Holocaust. It's the memorial.
And all kinds of memorials now have built into it this sense of loss.
Following that
Yeah.
Language,
Yeah.
a kind of convention,
Exactly.
of course, also, but that is recognizable, and you
Exactly.
can accept it as a memorial.
Yeah.
But it's in the same way that, all reference that you can't talk about trauma anymore without referring to the Holocaust. You can't talk about genocidal narratives.
Sure.
And it really is a paradigm at this point.
It
So to
became
try
a
to get
paradigm,
around it
whether
would be
we
very-
wanted
yeah,
it
no,
to
you
or
might
not.
know,
It
but it's
became
pretty hard
kind
to
of
get around it,
a benchmark,
Right.
against which other things are measured. And it did have an effect, and not just in architecture,
Well,
but
it
in
set a
art and
standard in a
literature.
sense, too.
Yeah, Levinas, the philosopher, struggles with silences and how to, Dan Pagis and Paul Celan struggle with silences in poetry and voids and emptiness. And John Cage, you wouldn't say that he's Holocaust inflected, but how do you? When does silence become like an object within your composition? And how many seconds is it?
Maybe we are speaking now about Western memorials and Western
Yes,
story,
and we are.
history. So if we expand it and look at genocide in other countries, we have many examples of that. Maybe if we start to interact and look at them, they maybe are not so connected to Holocaust.
Well, they even
And I know people
even
work
in
with
other
Armenian and
countries.
Turkish, I mean, they're
They're
absolutely
taking their
speaking.
cues from
Yeah.
this, and the
Cambodia,
museums in Cambodia,
absolutely.
those curators went to Auschwitz,
Right.
and then they came back and said, okay, this is what we're going to do.
Mm.
So they took their lead from the West, even though there are huge cultural differences. That's true. But this is where Maya Lin, I believe, actually established a post-war language, a vernacular that has had a huge influence. And what she did is the most poetic kind of architecture, where she opened a space in the landscape intended to open a corresponding space within us for memory. So it wasn't a matter of putting a big stone in the landscape, it was opening it like this. Not creating a flying wedge, a positive V, which is a very aggressive architectural elbow, like a military formation, but it's obverse. Instead of this, it's this, in which we are embraced. I mean, it's so brilliant. I mean, it's revelatory, the Vietnam Veterans Monument. And anybody following that, especially German monument makers, who were so stunned by that form, said, now we know that we also can find a form to articulate our ambivalence about remembering the Holocaust and the war and our tortured relationship to us, just as America was tortured about remembering the Vietnam War and its vets. And Maya Lin found that vernacular. And I kind of credit her for actually the sea change in memorial vernacular, after World War II.
And I think the whole, what I found really fascinating in the whole discourse around Maya Lin's story, let's say, was the tension between figurative and non-figurative representation. That was fascinating.
But some of that tension was manufactured by the losing artists. Frederick Hart in particular was such a sore loser that he went and recruited Ross Perot to raise money to create that figure of the three soldiers to put right there. But of course the tragedy is that Maya Lin's monument just puts those figures to shame.
Right.
It makes them look very small and cliched, and people, it's an afterthought. But the jury was unanimous in choosing Maya Lin. I mean, the vets on the jury were also unanimous. They understood what she had done, and it worked. It's horizontal. You can't even see it from the road. You descend into it. You come out of it. Your own image is reflected in it. It's humanly proportioned. It's not bombastic. Its axes point to the Washington Monument and the Lincoln Memorial. So it's definitely part of them all, but it's counterpointing the large neoclassic obelisks, with a black, what they used, some called that gash of shame, but it wasn't. It was meant to be a wound. I said, I'm cutting this into the earth. I am wounding the earth. And in her conceptual paragraph for the monument, she said, imagine taking a knife and cutting into the earth and then just moving it like that. That's what I am doing in this piece. And
It's amazing.
it absolutely works.
You walk up, you don't even know it's
No,
there.
it's
You don't
amazing.
even see it. It's quite remarkable.
It
And
is.
for my generation, it's work.
It is.
People who've lost loved ones there always. It's still
I
very.
remember
vibrant.
Wow.
that was going on. I mean, just again to go back and, for historical context, that was going on in 1980 and 81 when I was writing my dissertation and traveling. I was living in New York in 80 and moved to Israel in 81 and had just seen the whole controversy and had followed, with rapt attention this process and what ended up and all the discussion around it. So when I went to Israel, I was preoccupied by space and debates of monuments and so it was on my mind. And it's, I took hundreds of photographs of the sites where I was doing my research and presented that, and that's where everybody said, okay, let's see where it goes.
We have to conclude.
Oh.
I think we have hundreds of questions, and it's as if we just started. But last question to you, Edwin.
Last question to me? Oh, no. Let me think about that.
No, you.
I had another, I wanted to ask about the disappearing monument. I think it's Harburg and.
The disappearing and invisible monuments.
I guess it's
Garrett's.
invisible now. It's all the way in the ground, I believe, is it not? I don't know if you were part of that jury or not, but that strikes me as a sort of a counter memorial or an anti.
No, very much, and I kind of called them counter monuments for the ways that they countered the very traditional and conventional premises of a monument. Instead of being everlasting, it would disappear.
Disappearing. Yes.
Instead of pretending to hold a memory in perpetuity, in fact, it would show the ephemerality of memory, how memories do change and evolve over time. That memory is an animate process, and it needs to be a moving process. Jochen Gerritz and that whole generation actually was very suspicious of the monument in particular as something they regarded as an authoritarian art form, a big object telling you what to think, pretending to fix meaning and memory for all time, pretending to be a natural part of the landscape. And so they're not. They're made by human beings in human times. they're conditioned on all kinds of things. They come and they go. And especially after, what the Nazis did with monumentality, the way they fetishized monumentality and size and scale, how can we remember the victims of fascism and the forms of fascism? We refuse.
Yeah.
And so they threw it right back, in the face. But Maya Lin actually had an effect. It actually, they saw that if Maya Lin could find this form, they gave them hope. And that it broke something in them. It broke the ice for them too,
Yes.
so that they could go and do something else. But again, according to their vernacular that even preceded Maya Lin, they were already worrying about art that should destroy itself, art that should exist within our minds and not exist in the landscape at all. So Jochen Gertz and Horst Hoheisel and Michel Ullmann and Boltanski in some ways, this whole generation took this to heart and decided that they would never make the conventional monument again, especially commemorating the victims of fascism.
Translation is always, they say a text needs to be translated every generation, and there's always this
That's a good
forming
point.
and reforming process that goes on. There's never really a definitive translation. It's always sort of in
You don't
process.
want it fixed.
And it
yeah.
strikes me that your work in memorials is
Yeah.
also open to that
Yeah.
reforming.
The unfixedness. That's what I like about John Felstiner's translations so much, because often his translations of Celan were allowing the German to come into the English and then go back into the German a little bit. So it comes, appears, and goes back into the German a little bit, and that's what he wanted to do.
Yeah.
So we use his translations when I teach Celan. And I just love the way that parts of Todesfuge, will go back. In fact, it ends in the German original, and all the students know exactly what it is, even though they speak no German.
Yeah.
They know exactly what he's saying. This is very nice.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure.